In this video, we're going to talk about the financial implications for purchasing a home. So the good news is what we know about buying a car is basically the same thing about what we have to deal with from the standpoint of buying a house. The major changes are going to be the number of payments we have to make, in other words, the length of time you keep the loan, and of course the amount of principal. You borrow a lot more money when you buy a house than when you buy a car. However, the formula we use to calculate monthly payments for a mortgage are going to be the same as those that we use to calculate payments when we're talking about a car. So a mortgage is a long-term installment loan taken out for the purchase of a home or some piece of real estate. So when we get a mortgage, the property is pledged as security for the loan payments. In other words, it's there to back up the payments. What that means is that if you don't make the payments according to what your lender requires, the lender can then repossess the house because it's security for the loan. So if you've ever wondered why people are willing to loan anyone that much money, I mean, if you buy, a $200,000 house, why are they willing to loan you $200,000? And why are they willing to keep up that loan for 30 years? There's a lot of risk involved with extending a loan over 30 years. Well, the reason they're willing to do that is because in general, it isn't all that risky because the property is then security for the loan. So if you don't make the payments the way you're supposed to, well, they'll just take your house away. So ultimately, they're going to come out positive. The other benefit for the lender is the amount of interest that they're going to make. So if the lender makes interest off of a car at a certain amount, the lender makes all that more interest in terms of a house because the principal is so much higher and because they keep the loan and they maintain it for such a long period of time. So ultimately, they can repossess if they want, if you don't make payments the way you're supposed to, and they also just make a lot of money off of interest. That's going to be honestly the astounding part when we start looking at actual numbers. How much interest is associated with buying a house? That's where the cost really accrues. That's where buying a house really starts to become expensive, is when you look at how much interest you're going to have to pay. So what happens when you buy the house? What are the different components of the sale? Well, in most cases, 99% of the time, you're going to have to make a down payment. They do require that. When you buy a car, that may not be required, but in most cases, when you buy real estate, it is required. So the down portion is the portion of the down payment, is the portion of the sale that's paid up front. It's usually calculated as a percentage of the sale price, okay? So if you pay 20%, generally that's an acceptable down payment that's preferred. The benefit of paying like 20% of the sale price is that you don't have to pay mortgage interest at that point. If you pay less than 20%, then you may have to pay insurance. May have to pay for insurance for the actual mortgage until you have enough equity accrued in the house. So trade-off in terms of your down payment, if you don't have 20% up front, you may not have to pay 20% up front, but you may have to insure the mortgage until you've paid off at least 20% of the original sale price. Now, once you make the down payment, you make the determination for how much that's going to be. The actual amount of the mortgage is the difference between the down payment and the sale price. In other words, what did you actually finance? What was the negotiated sale price, the list price for the house? How much did you already pay? Well, the difference between the two is the actual amount of the mortgage. That's going to be the portion that you get as a loan. That's going to be the portion that's financed with the lender. So let's start by just calculating a down payment, calculating the mortgage amount, and then we'll look at the actual monthly payments for paying off the loan. So suppose you're purchasing a $220,000 house. The lender requires a down payment to the seller of 10% of the sale price. Determine your down payment and then determine the amount of the mortgage. So the down payment is going to be 10% of the sale price of $220,000. Anytime you see the word of in math, remember that means multiply. So 10% of the sale price means we're going to multiply the sale price by 10%. Now remember, you're not multiplying by 10, you're multiplying by the decimal version of 10, which is going to be 0.1. So for a sale price of $220,000, if our down payment is going to be 10%, we're going to multiply that by 0.1. So that's going to be $22,000. So what does that mean? Well, it means when you actually go to closing, when you go to sign on the dotted line, all the money changes hands. This is the amount you have to have available to pay directly on day one before they're going to give you the keys to the house. So that's what you have to pay up front. This will also be money that's not financed. So this particular amount is part of the sale price. It's part of the value of the house that you're paying, but because you're paying it up front, it's not going to be subject to interest. So the mortgage, the actual amount that is subject to interest, is however much is left over after you make this payment. So if you take the actual sale price and then subtract how much you already paid, that $22,000, that's going to be the amount of the mortgage. That's going to be the actual amount that's being loaned to you for purposes of purchasing the house, and that's going to be the portion of the sale price that you actually accrue interest on over time. So $198,000. Okay, so you've made your down payment. They've determined how much your mortgage amount is, how much they're going to loan you. Then you have to calculate your monthly payment. Those are going to be the payments you make over time to pay off that $198,000, as well as the interest that you're being charged for that particular loan. So your monthly payments are going to depend on 3 factors. Number 1, the mortgage amount, the principal for the loan, the interest rate, which of course varies over time, or varies just based on whatever the economic situation you're in, whatever the general economic situation of the country is, and of course the duration of the loan. So standard length of time is going to be 30 years, but you potentially may pay it off faster. You may have a loan that requires you to pay it off faster. It just depends on how you negotiate the terms of your mortgage agreement. Now, mortgages can have either a fixed or a variable interest rate. So fixed means that once they determine your rate, they lock it in, and regardless of what's happening economically speaking, that's going to be the rate you have for the duration of the loan. Variable rates can change over time. So benefits versus drawbacks. Well, fixed rate mortgages are going to have the same principal and interest payment over the life of the loan. You're going to make the same payment month to month in perpetuity. What can change? Well, your taxes can change, the insurance you pay can change, but actually paying off the house itself, you're going to make the same payment every single month for the next 30 years or however long your mortgage is going to be. So the benefit is predictability. You can plan ahead and you know exactly how much you're going to have to pay for the actual mortgage until it's paid off. Now, what if instead of a fixed rate mortgage, you go with a variable or an adjustable rate mortgage? In this case, the payment amounts can change over time depending on the dominant interest rate in the market. So in general, interest rates are dependent upon a lot of different factors. They're set at the federal level though, just depending on the situation that the economy is in. So they can start out low, they can go higher, they can adjust back and forth. So in general, with a variable rate mortgage, rates start out lower. That's in general why you would go with a particular mortgage agreement like this. But they can increase over time just depending on the economic situation in the country. Does that mean they can just increase without bound and eventually you may have a 20% interest rate? Well, fortunately, no. In most cases, your variable rate is capped so that it can't go past a certain amount. But you can't guarantee that it won't at least hit that cap and then stay there for a while. So there's some unpredictability involved with having a variable rate mortgage. You can't guarantee exactly what's going to happen. If you expect there to be good rates for a long period of time, then you may expect lower payments. But if the rates go up, then your payment for your mortgage is also going to go up. So most people are going to go with a fixed rate mortgage. Most lenders are going to offer you a fixed rate mortgage. So we're going to do calculations from the standpoint of a fixed rate mortgage, since again, that's going to be most common. So once we make our computations, what all goes into it? Well, in addition to the down payment, some lenders may require payment of points. Points can be used in different ways. So a point, a single point, is 1% of the mortgage amount. So you've already taken care of the down payment. You know how much is being financed. 1 point is going to be 1% of that financed mortgage amount. So say you were to pay 4 points. Well, 4 points would be 4% of the mortgage amount. So these may be used to cover additional fees at closing, which is the time when the mortgage actually starts. When they hand over the keys, when they take care of all the issues with the title, you may have to pay some points. So extra points can potentially be purchased. You can actually pay them in exchange for a lower interest rate. So if you pay the points, you may have higher closing costs. In other words, right there at the time when you actually put down your down payment, you put everything up front, you take care of all of the legal issues, all of that, you may have to pay more at that time. But by getting a lower interest rate, you may have lower monthly payments and you may end up paying less overall across the life of the loan. So one thing I want you to keep in mind with respect to points. Points represent fees. They don't represent money that's then defrayed from the cost of your mortgage. So you're paying 1% of the mortgage amount, but that is not an amount that you then get to subtract from the amount that you're financing. Points are actual fees that are paid to your lender that you don't ever get to see again. They don't decrease the amount of your mortgage. They are paid in order to get some type of benefit in your actual financing situation. So once you calculate points, that's it. That particular amount is paid, but it doesn't actually decrease the amount of your mortgage. It doesn't do anything to your monthly payments. Now, some lenders are also going to require you to put money into an escrow account, which is going to be separate from your principal and from your interest. So escrow, think of that as amounts that you're prepaying. That represents what you'll use to pay taxes, and you may use to pay interest or insurance. These payments are going to be above and beyond your actual mortgage payments, so they're not actually representative of principal and interest. What escrow is it's a way of accruing money to pay off additional things that you have to pay in association to home ownership. So rather than actually paying your property taxes or paying your homeowner's insurance yourself, you pay into what they call an escrow account, and then your lender makes all of these payments for you. So typically your account will have a few months worth of funds accrued at any given time. So if for some reason the money were to just trickle out and you weren't able to make payments for a little bit of time, there's sort of a cushioned amount that your lender could then use to make these payments for you, even if there's some economic hardship. So it's a prepayment account that's used to then pay for the other things associated with owning a house. But again, keep in mind, in terms of amounts associated with escrow, these are above and beyond your principal and interest. So what you pay into escrow is separate than what you're paying for your actual mortgage. So again, the mortgage amount is the actual amount associated with the house itself, the principal, the amount you were loaned, and then the amount of interest that they're then going to charge you on that. Okay, so let's talk about the actual payment. Let's get into the meat of the calculations. So because a mortgage takes on the form of an installment loan, a fixed installment loan, fixed payments, and we're paying it off in installments, the monthly payment looks the same as that for an auto loan. So same formula, just bigger numbers essentially. So same formula, calculating your payment. It's going to be your principal times the rate divided by N. Now in most cases we're making monthly payments, again just like with a car, so N is going to be 12 in those situations. And then our denominator again is the same kind of thing. What's going to be different? P is going to be higher because we're buying a house instead of a car. And then T is also going to be higher. In general, you finance your house for a lot longer than you finance a car. So those are going to be the kind of things that vary, but the actual formula is going to be the same for either situation. So let's look at a few examples. Okay. The price of a home is $220,000. The bank requires a 15% down payment and 2 points are required at closing. The home is financed with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage at 7%. Okay, we want to determine some different values that factor into the financing of this house. So first thing we want to find is the down payment. In other words, what do we have to pay up front before they're willing to finance this particular loan for us? Well, in this case, we require a 15% down payment of the list price. So we're going to take the list price and multiply it by 15%. So the list price is $220,000 times 0.15, and that's going to be $33,000. So that's going to be the amount we have to have up front to pay in order to get the keys to the house. They're not going to give us the keys to the house until we make that payment. So what's going to be the mortgage amount then? That's the next question. Find the amount of the mortgage. The amount of the mortgage is the list price minus whatever we paid as a down payment. It's the amount that we're being loaned. It's the amount that we're then financing. So $220,000 minus our down payment of $33,000. And that's going to be $187,000. So this is the principal for our loan. This is what's left over that we still have to pay off. And that's going to be the portion of the list price that's subject to interest. Okay, now before they give us the keys, we've got to take care of closing. So we're required to pay 2 points at closing. So that's going to be 2% of this mortgaged amount, of this financed amount. So we're going to multiply that mortgage amount by 2%, or 0.02. Now do not make the mistake of multiplying by 0.2. What does 0.2 mean? It means 20%. 20% would be 20 points at closing. No one's ever going to pay 20 points at closing. We're paying 2 points, or 2%, so 0.02. So 187,000 times 0.02, and that's going to be 3740. Now again, be careful with this number. This is a fee. This is something that's then paid at closing that you never get to see again. It does not decrease the amount of the mortgage. It's a fee that's used to buy additional benefits that take place at closing, but it doesn't factor into the calculation anywhere else after you've actually made that determination. That's just additional money that you have to pay up front above and beyond your down payment. Okay, so you've closed, you've paid your down payment, you've paid your points, everything's been negotiated. Now you have to pay off the house. So we're paying it off over 30 years at a fixed rate mortgage of 7% interest. So 7% interest per year over 30 years. Now we're making monthly payments, which means N is going to be 12. And keep in mind, when we do this calculation, this does not include anything that would go into escrow and anything that would involve insurance. So keep that in mind. This is just for paying off the house. It doesn't involve those other situations that go in above and beyond and have to do with home ownership. So our principal is going to be the mortgage amount. It's that amount that we finance. It's what's left over after we make that down payment. So P is going to be $187,000 in this situation. Our interest rate is 7%, so $187,000 times 0.07 divided into 12 parts since we're making monthly payments. And then our denominator, 1 minus the quantity, 1 plus 0.07 over 12. Remember, that fraction is essentially copied and pasted from numerator to denominator. And then our exponent is going to be negative 12 times 30, since it's a 30-year mortgage. So as we type this in, remember, we want to get that exponent first so we don't have to type multiplication inside of the exponent. So what's the exponent going to be in this case? Well, it's going to be negative 12 times 30, which is going to be negative 360. 360 represents the number of payments we're making. So N times a year, 12 times a year, for 30 years, represents a total of 360 payments. So you're going to make 360 payments to pay off the $187,000 and the interest that you're then charged. Okay, so when we get to that exponent, we're going to type negative 360. So let's get our payment. Now, as with the auto loan, remember, we just start with the denominator, just do the denominator in one line, and then we'll build off of that with the numerator. So our denominator is going to be 1 minus the quantity, 1 plus the fraction 0.07 divided by 12, close your parentheses, and then that's going to be raised to the negative 360th power. Now again, be careful with the negative. We're using the negative button, which is next to the decimal, not the subtraction button. If you use the subtraction button, it will give you a syntax error. Your calculator doesn't understand that. So we hit enter, and that's going to be the denominator. So again, as with the auto loans, this denominator should be less than 1. In this case, it's a little bit bigger than the denominator for the auto loan situation, but it's still less than 1. So it's a positive number, but it is between 0 and 1. Okay. So now we're building the numerator off of that. So it's the numerator divided by this number. So in parentheses, I want to type in my numerator. So 187,000, the principal, the amount of the mortgage, times the fraction 0.07 divided by 12. Close the parentheses, and all of that is my numerator. So remember, I'm taking that numerator and I'm dividing by that previous line, which represents my denominator. So divide by the answer from the previous line, which we get from second and negative. So that pulls up that previous line. Hit enter, and then we've got our value. And so if we're going to round to nearest dollar, $1,244 roughly per month. That's going to be the amount we pay. So what's included in that amount? Well, a portion of that amount goes towards principal. It goes towards actually paying off the $187,000. And then the other portion of that payment defrays the actual interest cost. So all of those calculations are actually done up front by the lender. They calculate in total how much they're going to charge you, including your principal and your interest. And then this formula is then used to distribute your interest over the life of the loan. So what's the same and what changes from payment to payment? Well, the actual payment amount is fixed. If you have a fixed rate mortgage, then you're guaranteed that you're going to make this payment, which again doesn't include taxes or insurance, which can change, but you're going to make this same mortgage payment every single month across the year for 30 years. So that's not going to change. Now, what does change month to month is how much of that goes towards principal and how much of that goes towards interest. So at the very beginning of your mortgage payments, at the beginning of the 30 years when you start paying off the house, you're paying more in interest and less in principal. So although the actual payment you're making is the same from month to month to month over 30 years, how that payment is broken down actually changes over time. So at the very beginning of your mortgage, more of that payment is going towards interest and less of it is going towards principal. Now, as time goes on, as you get closer to the 30-year mark, once you've paid off the loan, less of it goes towards interest and more of it goes towards principal. It's the same payment, but it'll be divided up in a different way. So what's potentially a good strategy for paying off this 30-year mortgage if you want to save some money? Well, if you make your payment month to month, which of course you have to do, another option is then to pay additional principal. So remember, it's divided up interest and principal. You pay your $1,244, but you can specifically pay additional and say that it needs to go towards principal. If you pay additional, maybe an extra $100 per month, even just that makes a difference. Say you pay extra, you specifically say that it needs to go towards defraying the principal amount. If that's the case, then you decrease the principal overall, and the interest rate can no longer apply to that principal that you've then paid off in addition to your regular monthly payment. So those are all things to take into account. You make the same payment, it's divided up in different ways, and because of that, paying additional principal just means that you potentially pay it off faster and you end up paying less overall in terms of your interest. Okay, so the interest, the question is, if we're making this payment month to month for 30 years, how much interest are we paying? And this is where it gets kind of crazy. We need to look at two different things. Number one, we need to know how much are we going to pay in total. So if we pay this amount month to month for 30 years, well, how much are we actually paying? So we're paying $1,244 per month. there are 12 months in a year, so times 12, that's the total amount we pay per year. And then we're paying that for 30 years. So our payment times 12 times 30 gives us the total amount we're going to pay, which is going to be $447,840. Now again, this does not include taxes and insurance. This is just paying the mortgage, just paying for the house itself. But for that $220,000 house and the $187,000 that we financed, this will be the total amount that we end up paying across 30 years, assuming we just make the scheduled payments and we don't pay any extra from month to month. So if this is how much we're paying, and this is how much we're actually paying off, this is how much we actually financed, then the difference between the two is going to be the amount of interest we pay. So if we subtract the $187,000 mortgage amount, the actual amount we financed, that is going to be the amount of interest we pay. What's surprising about that? Well, look at that and compare it to the other numbers in the problem. We financed $187,000. The house itself was worth supposedly $220,000. Well, the actual interest we pay is more than the house is even worth. So not only are we having to pay back the whole $187,000 that we borrowed, but we're paying this additional amount, which is more than the house itself is even worth. So if you're wondering why lenders are willing to give you so much money, and they're willing to lend you that money for 30 years, I mean, more than likely the person who writes your mortgage may not even be alive after 30 years. Why are they willing to loan you this much money? It's because this is how much they're making out of it. This is money that they get to keep that you don't see any benefit from. This is purely interest. This is a charge to you. That's the cost of getting that particular loan and having that money for that length of time. That's the cost to you. And that, among other reasons, is why they're willing to loan you so much money for such a long period of time, because they know they're going to make so much interest out of it. And of course, that is why it seems kind of scary to buy a house, among other reasons. But keep in mind, when you're buying a house, yes, you're having to pay this month to month and you end up paying this much interest. But the benefit of buying versus renting is eventually you can get your money back if you buy. If you ever have to sell your house, well, all the money that you paid into it, you get back out. That's called equity. That's how much of your house you actually own. So if you ever had to repay for a new house and you had to sell the current house, the money you've put in, you get back out. Whereas with renting, you may make this payment month to month, but once you leave, your leaselord or your landlord, your leaseholder, has that particular money and you don't get to see anything back for it. So there is a drawback to owning. You do have to pay a lot in terms of interest over the life of the loan, but at least if you ever have to sell your house, you're eventually going to get that money back and you'll see benefit for it again. Okay, let's look at another example. Comparison. Let's compare two different financing options for the same house. Just like you may have different financing options for a car, you may have different financing options for a house. How do you know what the better option is? Well, the trade-off with a car and the trade-off with a house are the same. Paying for a longer length of time means your monthly payments may be lower, but the trade-off comes down to interest. It means by extending your mortgage, by making payments for a longer period of time, the trade-off is that you have to pay more interest overall. Well, how much more do you have to pay? Let's do a comparison. So in terms of paying less interest, which option is more economical for a $150,000 mortgage? The first option is a 30-year fixed at 8%, or pay it off in 20 years and get a lower interest rate of 7.5%. So that's a 10-year difference. That's a major amount. 10 years, 12 payments per year, that's 120 fewer payments. So this would be 360 payments in total. This would be 240 payments in total. So you have to pay more month to month because you have less time. You have 10 years fewer to pay it off. But one of the effects of that is a lower interest rate. So the longer you finance it, your rate tends to be higher. Whereas if you commit to paying it off faster, you may get a lower interest rate out of that. Now, that's only a difference of 0.5%, but if we're talking about a large purchase, and a home is of course, in most cases, the largest purchase anyone will ever make, that 0.5% makes a major difference in the long run. So what we want to know is what really is the better deal in the long run and how much is saved in terms of interest. So remember, just like with a car, the actual financed amount does not represent truly a cost. If this house is worth $150,000, well, you get the house for $150,000, you pay them the $150,000, it's 1-to-1. So you get the property that's worth that amount, they get the cash that's worth that amount, so everyone comes out even. How does the lender make money? Well, they make money based on the interest that you're being charged. That goes towards them, and that's money that you don't see any benefit from. So the actual difference in cost represents the differences in interest from situation to situation. So let's look at the first option, 30 years, fixed rate at 8%. So our principal, the mortgage amount, is going to be $150,000 times 0.08 for our 8% rate, divided into 12 parts since we're making monthly payments. And then we have our denominator, 1 minus the quantity, 1 plus 0.08 divided by 12, raised to the -12 times 30 power. You're going to notice that particular exponent pop up a lot. 30 years is the traditional length of time for a particular, for a fixed rate mortgage. So 12 times per year times 30 years, that's going to be pretty much consistently the exponent anytime we're looking at one of these situations where we're financing a house. So that exponent of -360, you're going to see that a lot. So let's calculate this particular monthly payment. So start with the denominator, 1 minus the quantity, 1 plus 0.08 divided by 12, close your parentheses, and we're raised to the -360th power. That's going to be our denominator. Again, notice it's less than 1. It's supposed to be less than 1, but a positive number. Now we're building our numerator off of that. So in parentheses, our numerator is 150,000 times the fraction 0.08 divided by 12. There's our whole numerator. And we're dividing it by the denominator represented in that previous line. And that's going to be to the nearest dollar, $1,101. So that's going to be our monthly payment. We're going to make that payment every single month across the year for 30 years. So how much are we going to pay in total if that's what we pay? Well, we're paying $1,101 per month. There's 12 months in a year, and we're making that payment for 30 years since we're talking about a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So we're going to end up paying a total of $396,360. Keep in mind, that's how much we're paying for a $150,000 house. So the value for what we pay minus the actual value of the house, the value of the mortgage, how much we financed, is going to be the amount of interest. So $246,360 in interest. That's how much we have to pay under this particular mortgage agreement. Now, what if instead we guarantee that we're going to pay it off in 10 fewer years, so they're willing to give us a lower interest rate? Now, of course, because we're paying it off faster, we are going to have to pay more month to month. But how much more? And then what's the trickle-down effect to interest? So let's calculate the payment for 20 years with that new interest rate of 7.5%. So start with the denominator. Now be careful here because the exponent is different. It's 12 times a year, but now it's only for 20 years. So -12 times 20, -12 times 20 is going to be -240. So that's going to be the exponent in this case. So 1 minus the quantity, 1 plus 0.075 divided by 12. Okay, and that's raised to the -240th power. And that's going to be our denominator. Notice that's a slightly smaller denominator. If you remember what the denominator was for the previous one, that's a slightly smaller denominator. It's actually a reverse effect though. So if we're taking a numerator and dividing by a smaller denominator that actually ends up making the result larger. So that means this payment is going to be higher than the previous one. So let's build the numerator off of that. So 150,000 times 0.075 divided by 12. There's our numerator, close parentheses. And then we're dividing by that denominator in the previous line, which is going to be, to the nearest dollar, $1,208. That's going to be our payment month to month. So look at that. It's really only a difference of about $100. Well, why is it that small of a difference if we have 10 years involved in the difference in time length? It's because of interest. If we have 10 fewer years of interest to collect, well, yes, we have to pay more in terms of paying off the principal, paying off the interest faster. But because we have 10 fewer years attached to this loan, that 10 years represents a lot of interest that we're now not having to pay. So what's the actual effect? Well, how much would we pay in total? So we're going to pay $1,208 per month times the 12 months in a year. Now we're only paying this for 20 years. So now we're multiplying by 20. So the total amount we have to pay is $289,920. Immediately, that's a majorly different comparison. That's more than $100,000 different, just represented by paying an extra $100, or technically, I guess, $107 per month. That's a major, major difference. Well, how much of that is interest then? Well, we're still looking at the same house, so it's still the same financed mortgage amount. So from that, we're still subtracting $150,000. And that's going to be the amount of interest we pay. In this case, $139,920. So the difference between those two, that's the actual savings. It's the same house. The house is worth the same amount of money. The mortgage account or the mortgage amount is the same from situation to situation, but what's varying is the amount of interest. You have to pay interest no matter what, and it's still a large amount of money, but there's a major difference from the 30-year loan to the 20-year loan. So what's it going to be? Well, we have $246,360 for the 30-year minus $139,920 for the 20-year. And that is going to be the amount of interest saved, $106,440. So just by coming up with an extra $100 a month based on the negotiation and your willingness to pay over 20 years instead of 30, just by coming up with that extra $100 a month, this is the amount you end up saving overall. That's $106,440 that you never have to pay just by coming up with that extra $100 per month. So at that point, why would you not choose to do that? Well, from situation to situation, it may be more than $100. If you don't have that extra $100 a month, you don't have that extra $100 a month. But say, for instance, you negotiated for 30 years, which means you're required to make this payment, but say you chose to make an extra $100 payment per month. Well, the savings would not be as good just because the interest rate is still a little bit higher, but you'll have comparable savings in the long run just by making those additional payments, which then mean you have less principal and less time to accrue interest on that principal. So making those additional payments month to month will save you some overall. It may save you something close to that, depending on how much your house is worth and what your interest rate actually is. Okay, let's look at one final situation. Okay, so same thing, one house. Now we're comparing two different kinds of options. So we want to know which loan has the greater total cost. Okay, now what does cost mean in this situation? What's a cost from the standpoint of financing a house? Well, closing costs are actual costs. That's money we don't ever see back. So when we think of a cost, that's money that we don't actually see back. Remember, it's a one-to-one trade in terms of the house. You get the house that's worth a certain amount. They get the money for the house, but it's one-to-one. You each have something of equal value. Costs are going to be things that your lender then gets that you don't see any benefit from. So what could that look like? Well, closing costs, in other words, points, things like that, things you have to pay at closing besides your down payment. The down payment is part of the value of the house. So you're getting the house, they're getting the down payment. But any points you pay, that's a fee. They get that fee and you don't get to see that money again. Your interest, the interest is going to be the major part of cost for buying a house. Again, the interest is what you're paying in exchange for the use of their money for 30 years. So interest is money you never get back that your lender does receive, so it represents a cost to you. So we want to look at all the costs in these two situations and determine what's the better deal, what's going to cost more in the long run, what's going to cost less in the long run, just based on how these situations have been negotiated. Okay, so we have a $250,000 mortgage, and we have two different options for how we could go into closing. So both loans are going to be 30-year fixed loans. The first option is we have a 7.25% interest rate. We have closing costs of $2,000, and we have to pay 1 point. Okay, so the closing costs and the point, remember, those are actual costs. We pay those up front. They don't defray the cost of the mortgage. That's money that goes to the lender that we never get to see back. And in exchange, we have an interest rate of 7.25%. Now we have another option. Still a 30-year loan. We have a lower interest rate, 1% lower, so 6.25%. Now we pay closing costs of $350, but we have to pay 4 points. So what happened from situation to situation? Well, more than likely what happened is by paying the points, you were able to get the interest rate down. So you pay 1 point regardless, and you have a 7.25% rate. If instead you agree to pay 4 points, you pay that additional fee, you're buying down your interest rate. So you're getting from an interest rate of 7.25%, you're getting down to a 6.25% interest rate. So you're paying money up front in order to get that interest rate down, which then is distributed over that 30 years. So the question ultimately is it worth it? Do you actually see benefit from making that choice? Because by paying those points, you do have to come up with more money to pay at the very beginning, when automatically you may be taxed for money, particularly if this is your first house. You're already paying a lot that you've never had to pay before. So is coming up with this extra money really going to be worth it in terms of savings in the long run? That's ultimately the question we're asking. So let's go through option A and let's look at all the components that represent a cost. So again, closing costs are costs. The money goes to the lender, you don't get to see that money again. Points are a cost. The money goes to the lender, you don't get to see that money again. And then again, far and away, interest is the largest cost. You're paying that to your lender, and that's money that you don't get to see the benefit from. That's money that they get that you don't have anything else to show for, and it doesn't defray the cost of the house, and it's not money that you get back if you then have to resell the house. So what do all these components look like for option A? Well, we have to pay 1 point. What's that going to look like? Well, we're financing a $250,000 mortgage, so 1 point is going to be 1% of that amount. So 250,000 times 0.01. If you do that on the calculator, 250,000 times 0.01. So that's going to be $2,500. So that's a $2,500 fee that you pay up front. Now we know we have closing costs of $2,000. So that's also going to be tacked on to that point in addition. And then we also need to know after the fact, once we've negotiated all of this and we pay interest over those 30 years, how much interest are we going to pay? What's that going to look like? Well, we cannot calculate interest directly. Anytime there's compounding involved, there is no way to directly calculate interest. The way we have to calculate interest here is, number one, we need to know what is the monthly payment. That's going to tell us how much we pay per month. From that, we can determine how much we pay across the life of the loan. And then from that, we can determine the difference between the total amount and the mortgage amount, which then represents interest. So even though it didn't ask for the monthly payment, we need to know what it is in order to calculate the interest. So our principal is $250,000. We have an interest rate of 7.25%, so 0.0725, and we're paying it for 30 years. Okay, so let's start with the denominator. 1 minus 1 plus the fraction 0.0725 divided by 12. Okay, and then 12 times 30, that's going to be 360 payments. So raised to the negative 360th power. That's going to be our denominator. So our numerator, 250,000 times the fraction 0.0725 divided into 12 parts. There's our numerator. And then we're dividing it by that denominator from the previous line. And that's going to be our payment. So roughly $17.05 per month. And again, some of that goes towards principal, some goes towards interest. Well, the question is, based on making that payment 12 times a year for 30 years, how much interest are we being charged, given that the amount that we financed was $250,000? Well, how much do we pay in total? So we're paying $17.05 per month times the 12 months in a year for 30 years. That's going to be the total amount we pay, so $613,800. Now, $250,000 of that was principal, so part of what we're paying off is principal, the rest of it is interest. So minus $250,000 is going to give us a total of $363,800, specifically interest. So what is the total cost to us for this loan? What are all the different components that we don't ever get back? Well, we don't get back any points we paid. We don't get back any closing costs. We don't get back any interest. So we had $2,000 in closing costs. That 1 point cost $2,500. And then the interest over the life of the loan is going to be $363,800 for a total of $368,300. That's going to be the total cost of this loan once it's all paid off. Okay, now we want to compare this to the next option. So again, the general idea is we paid more points up front in order to get a lower interest rate, in order to save 1%'s worth of interest. The question is it worth it? Do we actually see savings in the long run based on paying that additional amount up front? Okay, so we have 4 points. Okay, so our mortgage amount is $250,000. That didn't change, but now we're charging 4 points. So 4 times 0.01, or you can think of it as 0.04. So we have $250,000 times 4%, so 0.04, which is going to be $10,000. And again, that's going to be a fee. That's money we have to pay up front at closing in order to negotiate our interest rate down by 1%. So that's going to be part of our cost. That's $10,000 that we don't get to see back. Okay, we know there are closing costs of $350 above and beyond that $10,000. So automatically, we have more cost so far. In the previous situation, it was $2,000 up front and then $2,500 in points. Now we have $350 up front and $10,000 in points. But what is the effect on interest based on us getting that interest rate down by 1%? Well, we need to know what's the payment going to be, how much are we going to pay overall, and then what's the difference between what we pay and how much we financed. So our principal's not going to change, 30 years is not going to change, 12 times a year is not going to change. The only thing that changes for option B is going to be that interest rate. So let's do the denominator, 1 minus 1 plus 0.0625 divided by 12, and all of that is raised to the negative 360th power, so raised to the negative 360. Okay, there's our denominator. Build the numerator off of that, so 250,000 times 0.0625 divided by 12, and then all of that is divided by the denominator from the previous line, so second and negative, and that's going to be about 1539. So immediately we can see a difference. How do we know there's a major difference here? Well, it's the same house. We're paying off the same house over the same length of time. And look at the difference in monthly payments. We went from $1,705 per month to $1,539 per month. So that savings there automatically may be enough to make that $10,000 worth of points worth it. Is it truly though? We need to make that determination. So what's the actual effect in the long run of that savings from month to month? Well, how much are we paying in total? Well, we pay $1,539 per month, 12 times a year for 30 years. So we're going to pay a total of $554,040 minus the $250,000 that we financed represents our interest. So $304,040. Big difference there. That immediately, just that difference is probably enough to tell us that the points were worth it. Yes, we paid more up front for option B than we did for option A. But look at the savings and interest already. It's close to $60,000 worth of interest that's saved. So let's compare the total cost from one to the other. So what's the total cost for option B? Well, we had $350 of specific closing costs, $10,000 from those 4 points, and then the $304,040 for interest, for a total of $314,390 that's a cost to us. So the question was, which loan has the greater total cost? In this case, option A has the greater total cost. What's the actual difference between the two? Well, option A, $368,300 total cost, so closing costs, points, and interest, minus $314,390 for option B. And that's going to be $53,910. That is how much more we spend with option A than with option B. So then the question is, if you save that much, why would you not automatically go with option B? The reason you might not is because of that additional $10,000 up front. Again, if you're a first-time homeowner, you haven't ever bought a house before, you don't have any equity to work off of, this is all money that you're having to come up with for the first time. And $10,000 is potentially a lot to come up with as a first-time buyer. So $2,500 versus $10,000, if you don't have that additional $7,500 up front, unfortunately you just don't have it, which means you wouldn't be able to buy down your interest rate. So even though there are certainly benefits to being able to do that, again, it just boils down to your financial situation at the time. Can you afford it at the time when you're purchasing your house? If you can, then certainly the savings are worth it in the long run if you can afford that. But if you can't afford it, then unfortunately you go with option A, which ends up costing more in the long run. So just like with buying a car, there are a lot of different things that you have to weigh. What can you afford month to month? What seems feasible at the time when you buy? All of those things have to be taken into account.